Welcome back, everyone. Ready to dive into some seriously fascinating CBRN stuff?
Always ready to geek out about CBRN. Let's do this.
This time, we're digging into the April 2024 issue of CBRN World Magazine, and let me tell you, it's packed with some eye-opening insights.
Definitely eye-opening, sometimes a little unnerving, but hey, knowledge is power, right?
Absolutely. So the magazine jumps right in talking about how CBRN response is changing big time. Like, forget those old school Cold War scenarios.
Yeah, it's a whole new ball game now. And one of the biggest shifts is the focus on CBRN health response. Like France and the UK, they've been ahead of the curve on this, investing heavily in specialized ambulance and health response teams.
So they're not just waiting around for casualties to be decontaminated.
Nope, they're going in, geared up, and ready to provide medical care right there in the hot zone.
Wow, I can't even imagine being a paramedic in full hazmat gear heading into a potential CBRN situation. Talk about intense.
Absolutely. And it's not just them. The magazine highlights how other countries are stepping up their game too, like Poland. They're making big moves to boost their CBRN health response capabilities, taking cues from the UK and France.
It really shows how the nature of the threat has evolved, right? You need that immediate on-the-ground medical response now more than ever.
No doubt. It's a different world out there, and we need to be ready for anything.
Speaking of a different world, the magazine takes us back in time to a pretty chilling nuclear incident, the SL-1 incident. It happened way back in 1961, but it's got some seriously relevant lessons for today.
Right, SL-1 is a stark reminder that even with the best planning, accidents happen, and when they involve nuclear reactors, well, the consequences can be pretty severe.
This was at a U.S. Army experimental reactor, right? What exactly happened?
So, during a routine maintenance procedure, something went terribly wrong, leading to a steam explosion and 3 fatalities. It's actually the only fatal reactor accident in U.S. history.
Wow, the only one. That's kind of reassuring but also terrifying at the same time.
Yeah, I know what you mean. But here's the thing about SL-1. The response was incredible. The magazine called it exemplary, especially given the crazy challenges they were facing.
Okay, so they're dealing with a nuclear meltdown, 3 fatalities. What made their response so exemplary? Give me the details.
One detail that stuck with me was the recovery of one of the victims. They found him pinned to the ceiling by a control rod.
Oh, wow.
Can you imagine?
Yeah.
The radiation levels were off the charts, so they had to take extreme measures to minimize exposure, both for the recovering teams and the environment.
They're basically writing the playbook on nuclear accident response on the fly.
Exactly. They were monitoring everything for radiation, even checking the thyroids of sagebrush and jackrabbits in the area.
That's wild. It just shows you can't predict everything, but learning from past events like SL-1 is crucial for being prepared no matter what crazy stuff comes next.
Couldn't agree more. And speaking of crazy stuff, the magazine takes a bit of a turn, delving into a couple of threats that most people wouldn't even think about.
Oh, this is where it gets really interesting. Lay it on me. What kind of threats are we talking about?
Well, the magazine dives into this whole thing about parasites as potential bioweapons.
Okay, you're kidding, right? Parasites. I mean, I vaguely remember those from high school biology, but bioweapons?
Yeah, no, it sounds like something out of a bad sci-fi movie, but the reality is parasites, they can be incredibly potent and surprisingly easy to get a hold of, which makes them a real threat if someone wants to weaponize them.
So we're talking way more than just a nasty stomach bug here.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The magazine even brought up this chilling example from World War II. Japanese Unit 731, they actually used plague-infected fleas as a bioweapon.
No way.
Yeah. And it was devastating, even more deadly than the atomic bombs, at least in terms of casualties.
That's horrifying. And to think something as small as a flea could cause that much destruction, it's a crazy reminder of how vulnerable we really are to this stuff.
I know, right? And one of the biggest challenges with parasite bioweapons is detection. Imagine trying to figure out if an outbreak is natural or a deliberate attack.
Oh man, it'd be like trying to find a needle in a haystack. Except the needle is microscopic and wants to kill you. And if parasites weren't creepy enough on their own, the magazine also goes into this whole weaponized genomics thing. What does that even mean?
So think about all the incredible advances we've made in personalized medicine, right? Gene sequencing, stuff like that. Now imagine that same technology being used to create bioweapons that are tailored to target specific individuals based on their DNA.
Hold on, are you saying someone could create a bioweapon that only affects people with, like, a certain gene, like, say, having blue eyes or being predisposed to certain diseases?
Exactly. Pretty wild, huh?
That's both fascinating and terrifying at the same time.
Right. It's like something out of a dystopian sci-fi novel, but the science is there. And it brings up so many ethical and social implications. Like, where do we draw the line?
Okay, so let me get this straight. We've got paramedics in hazmat suits, nuclear meltdowns, parasite detectives, personalized bioweapons.
It's a lot to unpack.
This magazine is really running the gamut here. What else did they cover?
Well, they also explore how technology is shaping the CBRN landscape, for better or for worse.
Okay, so it's not all doom and gloom. There's some light at the end of this tunnel. Tell me more.
One area they really focused on is the role of artificial intelligence, especially in threat detection. Imagine a system that can analyze mountains of data from tons of different sources, all to identify CBRN threats way faster and more accurately than we ever could before.
Okay, that sounds like something straight out of Mission Impossible. I want in.
Right, it's some pretty impressive technology, but here's the catch. That same tech can be used for, shall we say, less noble purposes. The magazine actually uses this term virtual anthropoth.
Virtual androp. Okay, now you're just messing with
No,
me.
seriously, it describes these AI systems that are trained on the decision-making of, like, historical figures. But the thing is, they could end up replicating their biases, even their paranoia.
So we're talking about AI that could potentially launch a nuclear attack because it learned from the mistakes of the past.
It's a chilling thought. Right. But that's the thing. We have to consider the ethical implications when we develop and deploy these crazy, powerful technologies. And AI isn't the only tech game changer they discussed. Let's talk about drones for a second.
Drones, I mean, yeah, they deliver packages and give us those cool aerial shots, but how do they play into this whole CBRNA world?
Well, imagine this. A drone releasing fentanyl over a packed football stadium.
Oh my God.
The casualties could be catastrophic.
That's a terrifying thought. And fentanyl is so potent, even a tiny amount could be devastating.
Exactly. It's a nightmare scenario. And it really highlights the urgent need for some serious countermeasures.
Yeah.
Not just technological, but also in terms of preparedness, how we respond, and how different agencies work together.
So what can we do? Like, realistically?
Well, the magazine talks about something called counter-UAS technology. Basically, ways to detect, disable, or redirect these rogue drones. But technology alone isn't enough, right? We need to be thinking about public awareness, training first responders, and seriously beefing up security at large events.
It's a multi-pronged problem, so we need a multi-pronged solution.
Precisely. But it's not all about high-tech solutions either. The magazine also talks about some really promising developments in the more, I guess, traditional aspects of CBRN response, like decontamination, for example. They go into detail about some new technologies that are way faster, more effective, and much more environmentally friendly.
Now that's something I can get behind. Faster, more effective, better for the planet. Sign me up.
Right. It's encouraging to see progress being made on that front. And speaking of progress, they also discuss the growing use of virtual reality for CBRN training.
Oh yeah, VR training. I've heard about that. It's like a CBRN simulator, right?
Pretty much. It allows responders to experience these crazy realistic scenarios, practice their skills, and test out different strategies, all in a safe, controlled environment.
That's amazing. It's like a giant life-saving video game. But with all this talk about fancy technology, it's easy to forget that sometimes the simplest solutions are the best, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And speaking of simple yet effective solutions, the magazine actually had a great piece on the importance of arms control in mitigating CBRN threats.
Arms control. I don't think I would put those two together. Tell me more.
So there's this really insightful article by Dr. Jeffrey Lewis, and he makes a really compelling case for how intertwined arms control and CBRN response actually are.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
For example, a lot of the regulations we have today regarding how we handle and transport dangerous materials, those actually stem from arms control agreements.
So these agreements that are focused on like preventing all-out war, they're indirectly protecting us from accidental or even intentional releases of dangerous materials too.
You got it. And with all the rapid advancements in technology, especially in areas like AI and biotechnology, Dr. Lewis argues that arms control is even more vital now than ever before.
Because those same technologies that have the potential to like revolutionize medicine or combat climate change, they could also be used to create new and terrifying weapons.
Exactly. And Dr. Lewis's point is that arms control helps us mitigate those risks, ensuring that these incredibly powerful technologies are actually used for good not for harm.
It really makes you think about the big picture, doesn't it? Like how interconnected everything really is.
Absolutely. And speaking of the big picture, Dr. Lewis uses this really fascinating analogy. He talks about a geopolitical dog, with arms control being the tail wagging the dog.
Okay, I'm not sure I follow. Break that down for me.
Essentially, he's saying that arms control, it's not happening in a vacuum. It's heavily influenced by larger geopolitical forces, like the relationships between nations, the level of trust they have, and even perceived threats. And right now, that geopolitical dog, it's looking a little agitated, wouldn't you say?
With everything going on in the world today, yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. So, if arms control is like the tail trying to control this anxious dog, what can we do as individuals to be prepared?
That's the million-dollar question,
Yeah.
right? And the magazine actually addresses that head on. They have a whole section dedicated to practical steps that individuals can take to be more prepared for a potential CBRN incident.
Okay, I'm all ears. Hit me with it. What can we do?
First and foremost, they stress the importance of staying informed, know the risks, understand the different types of threats out there, and keep up with current events. Knowledge is power, right?
Absolutely.
But it's not about freaking out or becoming paranoid. It's about being aware and prepared. They also recommend having a plan. Like, what would you do in case of an evacuation? Where would you go? How would you connect with your loved ones?
So it's like having a fire escape plan for your home, but for a CBRN event.
Exactly. And of course, they suggest having a basic emergency kit ready to go. Water, food, a first aid kit, a flashlight.
Mhm.
The essentials.
It sounds like common sense, but I can see how in a real emergency, those things could easily slip your mind.
Oh, for sure. It's easy to get overwhelmed in the heat of the moment. But as we've seen in this deep dive, these threats are real and they're constantly evolving. So we can't just bury our heads in the sand.
Okay, so we've got to be informed, have a plan, and be prepared. But what about the more like practical, tangible stuff? What are some of the new technologies and products being developed to actually combat these threats?
Oh, there's some really cool advancements happening right now. One that I found particularly fascinating was an article about Aeroclav's new partnership with Hunter Apparatus.
Aeroclav. They're the ones behind those amazing decontamination systems, right? The ones that use dry heat to neutralize pathogens and hazardous materials.
That's the one. And thanks to this partnership, their reach is expanding significantly, making these cutting-edge decontamination systems available to even more first responders and emergency management agencies.
That's fantastic. It means more communities will have access to that incredible technology. What else is new in the world of CBRN tech?
Well, there was this really cool article about a new handheld mass spectrometry device called the MX908. They're using it to rapidly identify drugs and chemical threats in the field.
Hold on, mass spectrometry, that sounds incredibly complicated. I wouldn't even know where to begin with something like that.
Right. But that's the beauty of this MX908. It's small, portable, and surprisingly easy to use. It can identify a huge range of substances in minutes, giving first responders vital information about the threat they're facing.
That's incredible. It's like having a mobile lab right there in your pocket.
Exactly. And it really highlights how technology is empowering our first responders, giving them the tools they need to stay one step ahead of these evolving threats.
You know, it's easy to get caught up in all the scary headlines, those worst case scenarios, but I have to say, I'm also really impressed by the ingenuity and the dedication of the people who work in the CBRN field.
Me too.
They're constantly innovating, pushing the boundaries of what's possible to keep us all safe.
Absolutely. It's a field that demands incredible technical expertise and a really strong sense of responsibility. I mean, they're dealing with threats that could potentially impact every single one of us.
And that brings us to one of the most fascinating and honestly one of the most unsettling topics covered in this issue, the threat of fentanyl being used as a weapon of mass destruction at large events.
Yeah, that article was definitely a sobering read. It's one thing to think about fentanyl overdoses as a public health crisis, which it absolutely is, but to consider it being deliberately released at a crowded event.
It's a terrifying thought, and what really struck me was just how accessible this stuff is. We're not talking about some obscure chemical weapon that takes like a sophisticated lab and years of research to produce.
Right. As the article pointed out, it's relatively easy to obtain, and its potency means even a small amount could have devastating consequences.
And the article really paints such a vivid and honestly terrifying picture of like a drone releasing fentanyl over a packed stadium. It's definitely the kind of scenario that keeps you up at night.
I hear you. And while technology definitely has a role to play in mitigating those kinds of threats, it's clear that we need to be having some serious conversations about preparedness, response protocols, and honestly, the ethical implications of technologies that can be so easily weaponized.
So much to unpack. So we've got this incredibly potent drug that's readily available. The technology to deliver it remotely is becoming increasingly accessible. It feels like a recipe for disaster. What's being done to address this specific threat? So we've got this incredibly potent drug that's readily available, and the technology to deliver it remotely is becoming increasingly accessible. It feels like a recipe for disaster. What's being done to address this specific threat?
Well, the article really stresses the importance of training, making sure first responders know how to recognize the signs of a fentanyl overdose, how to administer naloxone.
Naloxone, that's the
Yep.
antidote, right?
Exactly.
Mm.
And of course, how to decontaminate themselves and others effectively.
It sounds like in that kind of situation, speed is key.
Absolutely. Every second counts.
Hmm.
And it can't just be a one-man show. The article really emphasizes the need for better communication and collaboration between different agencies. Law enforcement, public health officials, emergency medical services. It's not just a hazmat situation anymore. Everyone needs to be on the same page.
And it goes beyond just the first responders, too, right? I mean, the venues hosting these events, they have a role to play as well.
Exactly. The venues need to step up, start thinking about fentanyl as a real and present danger. They need to have specific response protocols in place, just like they do for, say, bomb threats or active shooter situations.
Makes you wonder if we'll start seeing venues investing in, like, misting systems or other technologies that can help disperse fentanyl in the air, maybe reduce its potency.
It's definitely a possibility, especially as these threats become more common. And it's not just about stadiums and concert halls either. The article also talks about the risks of fentanyl being released in other public spaces. Subway stations, airports. It's a scary thought.
It really drives home the point that these threats, they can pop up anywhere, at any time. It's like we're living in a Tom Clancy novel.
In a way, I guess we are. And that's where public awareness is so crucial. The more people who understand the risks of fentanyl, the signs of an overdose, the better equipped we'll be as a society to respond quickly and effectively. Knowledge is power, my friend, especially when it comes to CBRN threats.
Couldn't agree more. Okay, so taking a step back, we've covered a ton of ground in this deep dive. Shifting landscapes and CBRN response, lessons learned from past disasters, those invisible threats like parasites, and then, of course, the mind-blowing and honestly terrifying potential of weaponized genomics is a lot to process. The one takeaway I keep coming back to is that the world of CBRN is complex and it's changing faster than ever.
It absolutely is. And as technology continues to advance at this crazy pace, we're bound to see even more groundbreaking and potentially unsettling developments in the years to come.
Which kind of begs the question, with all this focus on the threats, the risks, is there any room for optimism? What can we do to make sure all this incredible technology we're developing, that it's used for good, not for harm?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And while I don't have a crystal ball, I do know one thing. We can't just sit back and be passive observers. We all have a role to play in shaping the future, in making sure these technologies are used responsibly and ethically. Whether it's through education, advocacy, or even just staying informed, we can all do our part to create a safer, more resilient world.
Beautifully said. Well, on that note, as we wrap up our deep dive into this issue of CBRN world, it's clear that the world is grappling with some seriously complex and constantly evolving challenges, but it's also a world full of brilliant minds working tirelessly to find solutions to keep us safe.
Absolutely. And that's an important message to remember. The threats are real. There's no denying that. But so is our capacity for innovation, for resilience, for compassion.
So well said. A huge thank you to everyone for joining us on this deep dive into the world of CBRN. We'll leave you with this thought. How can we, as individuals, as a global community, harness the power of technology for good while also being mindful of the risks it presents? Something to ponder. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.